Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to continue with the A-level specification for attachment and looking at specifically this time the Romanian Orphan studies, and they ask us to look at the effects of institutionalization. So I've actually split this up into several different parts. I'm going to look specifically at Rutter studies on Romanian orphans. Then I'm going to give you a few other versions of this, and then have a separate section on the effects of institutionalization. However, during this video, you can see during the Rutter study that you will be able to kind of see the effects of institutionalization in that. So let's start with a few terms. First of all, we're going to talk about institutional care. And with institutional care, we see that these children lack the necessities of life. And if you went back to my privation definition, you'll see that lacking the necessities in life was kind of what privation was about. So we would expect that a child that grows up in an institution is likely to suffer from the effects of privation. And there's been several studies that have actually looked at children in institutions or children's homes, and we're going to look at a couple of them, and most of them kind of highlight the danger of failing to form attachment. So let's look at the Romanian orphan studies. Now, of course, a key person in this is going to be a person, Rutter. Remember, Rutter came up previously when we were being critical of Bowlby, and the first, he was kind of saying that Bowlby kind of misinterpreted his understanding of maternal deprivation with privation. So this is a study published in 2011, and you're going to see that this is a longitudinal study because these children, or the initial parts of this particular situation, was going to kind of start happening in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, you can call it Rutter, or you can call it the ERA, the English and Romanian Adoptee Studies. And you can see from that picture, it's quite a stark kind of picture of children kind of what appear to be living in destitution. Now, I'd like to think that actually is not, and this is a fake image, but unfortunately it is quite true. And the reason for this is that in Romania at the time, after the fall of Ceausescu, there was kind of lots of there's a revolution, there's a lot of kind of fighting, and money wasn't particularly good, and media kind of went in, and they discovered kind of children living in Romanian orphans, and they were living in absolute an absolute, can't even think of the word now, and were showing signs of severe malnourishment. Now, I think I've kind of showed you a couple of videos in class, and certainly if you look for Romanian orphan studies on YouTube, you'll certainly come across several different examples of this. But what we're looking at is a group of children of 165 Romanian orphans who were adopted to the UK. One of the things about the media coverage, it meant that many of these children were rescued and kind of taken into homes in Canada, the USA and the UK, and Rutter comes in and uses this as an opportunity to kind of understand institutionalization and to kind of work with these children. There are no ethics involved in this because it's a natural situation that was happening that he had no control over. He's just kind of having a look at kind of the effects of what these children were going through. Now, adding a bit of kind of detail over time, he looked at physical, cognitive and emotional development of these children. We're going to focus mostly on cognitive and emotional. The physical side is very similar to this idea that if you're born prematurely, you're likely to once everything is kind of fine and you kind of have the food and the care that you need, that you're going to grow okay. But it's the cognitive and emotional aspect that Rutter does kind of highlight for us, and we see that these children were investigated over a period of time. But he also then had a control group of 52 British children. They were also adopted around about the same time. The purpose of this, of course, is to make sure that we are comparing kind of adopted children with adopted children. Though, of course, there's going to be a big difference between these two groups, because we see that all of the UK babies were adopted before 6 months, and only a very small amount of the Romanian orphans were. So let's look at some of the findings. We see that when they arrived, we see that we see that most of them were severely undernourished, but also many of them were showing signs of mental retardation. Now, this is obviously not a very nice kind of phrase to call somebody, but it was a clear indication in terms of a kind of like a diagnosis that these children were clearly showing kind of signs of kind of being held back, kind of mentally not being able to be in the right developmental stage. Now, of course, as the adoption studies continued till age 11, what we find is we just make the statement of differential rates of recovery. In other words, the children recovered at different rates dependent on the age of adoption. One of the ways we can kind of see this is when we looked at IQ, we see that actually if they're adopted before 6 months, they were an average IQ. 102 is an average IQ. But as the time goes down in terms of where they are, we see that actually the IQ drops quite significantly. Now, I don't know what an IQ of 77 would be, but that is well below average, and therefore kind of very basic kind of functioning would be expected from those babies. Now, you don't need to remember Beckett's name, but Beckett kind of looked at these children, and we see that these differences did remain until they're 16. So effectively, they did not catch up. They didn't kind of suddenly get better after time. And so what we can then say about Rutter's study is that he showed us that there is a difference in the outcome depending on whether you adopted early or late. So that's before or after 6 months. There's a difference depending on when you were adopted. And that's possibly why in the UK we do have a lot of kind of pressure to make sure that babies that are given up at birth are adopted before the age of 6 months. Now, if you're adopted after 6 months, you also had another effect, and this was called disinhibited attachment. Okay, and so obviously looking at the word disinhibited, this is the form of attachment in which you kind of don't seem to have too many boundaries. So it seems here you're attention seeking, you're clingy, you have social behavior that really does kind of work towards indiscriminately towards adults that are both familiar and unfamiliar. Now, as you would say, if you're looking at Schaffer's stages of development, we would expect a baby to show some kind of discrimination at some particular point and kind of effectively choose their attachment figure over anyone else. But of course, they're not doing this. That's familiar and unfamiliar. But we find that if they're adopted after the age of 6 months, before the age of 6 months, they very rarely actually had this disinhibited attachment. So we could say that that is another effect that Rutter kind of showed us, that this disinhibited attachment. So long-term consequences of privation of institutional care are pretty much quite severe for children if they don't have an opportunity to form attachment. If the consequences are there for children adopted before 6 months, they're certainly less severe. Now, the second kind of part of looking at the Romanian orphans is to also look at some other studies that did exist at the time. And we also have the Bucharest Early Intervention Program. And this was something which was coming from Romania itself. And this particular study used the strange situation to assess attachment of these Romanian children. Now, of course, what is quite clear here is maybe the strange situation may not be the most appropriate, but it is using some form of measure that we are familiar with. And we see that most of these children had actually lived in an institutional care. So about 90% of them had done this. And what we find is that compared with a control group who had not lived in an institution, we were able to kind of make some kind of judgment towards them. So, for example, they showed disinhibited attachment, they were clingy, attention-seeking, and acted inappropriate towards adults. So the Bucharest Early Intervention Program is also kind of showing us that these children have this kind of disinhibited attachment. We find that a control group comes up as being securely attached in the strange situation, and that only 19% of the children who were in the institutions end up being securely attached. So this is quite significant, and we find that this disinhibited attachment may well actually be part of it, because we see that 65% of them have disinhibited attachment. From the institutionalized children, they were specifically said to have disinhibited attachment, but of course only a small group of the control group were. So once again we see that there's a clear kind of indication between the disinhibited attachment and being in institutions. Now, those are two studies that we can use that make direct reference to the Romanian orphans. So if I'm going to be critical of them, we need to kind of see what is both good and bad. And we see that the main thing that we take from this is real life application. We understand the effects of institutionalization a lot more clearly. For example, Langdon says that these particular studies have helped us improve the way that we care for children these days. We know, for example, that we have fewer children's homes, and we avoid having a large number of carers for each child, and we kind of make sure that there is at least 2 or 3 people who are specifically there to kind of look after the child. We call these people key workers, and we find that that's a significant change within care work within the UK. And the idea of these key workers is to have some kind of normal attachment towards these children, and perhaps to avoid any form of disinhibited attachment that they might show. And so, of course, we've taken the Rutter research and things like that, when this has been applied to kind of adoption laws in the UK, but also in terms of any child in care, kind of having that key worker, having somebody specifically to look after them. But we do have some kind of concerns. Now, it's said methodological issues, and this is potentially unavoidable, but it comes up as a confounding variable. What we find is that the children who were adopted were not randomly assigned to kind of the condition of whether they're adopted, and at what stage and things like that. And of course that we could expect that they may bring up some problems. So, for example, the children who adopted first were probably the ones who are more sociable. This is kind of realistic if you think about your own situation. If perhaps you're adopting a cat or a dog and stuff like that, you kind of want to go for the ones that are kind of friendly and nice. And so, of course, this idea that we can't control which child was adopted and which particular situation they're put in becomes a confounding variable, because it could be their socialization that could have affected the outcome. Now, of course, we wouldn't be able to control for these variables, because it would be pretty unethical. It says, however, to control such variables, other major investigations of fostering versus institutional care did use random allocation. So it's kind of one of these things that Rutter kind of was taking the natural situation that we're in and having a look at it. But, for example, the Bucharest Intervention Program didn't have such controls as what Rutter did, and they did randomly assign people. And of course, that then negates my concern about the Rutter problem. But as I said, it does raise some ethical issues. But the key is that both of these particular studies do seem to give some kind of indication of very similar outcomes. But of course, what we can also then say is that even though we have them as kind of helpful and kind of studies that kind of we can learn from, they don't give us a complete picture of what actually does go on and what is the effects of institutionalization. And this certainly kind of leads into this kind of whole kind of topic of the effects of institutionalization. And of course, there's lots of different effects that we've already kind of had a look at. So I'm going to kind of give you kind of an outline that's a bit repetitive. So the first one, of course, is disinhibited attachment, and this is seen as a clear effect of spending time in an institution. They're very friendly and affectionate towards people that they know and people that don't know. It's highly unusual behaviour, because these children should show some form of strange anxiety at some stage, but of course they're not. Rutter said this is possibly because when they were living in a care home, they had multiple carers during this particular time, and many of the poor institutions potentially had up to 50 carers at a different time. And this kind of links to kind of previous points where we kind of looked at these types of institutions which would probably expect people to fulfill roles and not to look after children, so therefore could affect kind of the outcome of their care. We also see that many of the children had mental retardation as well when they arrived in Britain. But of course, if they're adopted earlier, they were pretty much able to be as caught up as the control group. But of course, it is an effect of institutionalization. And this is kind of as expected. Says damage to intellectual development can be recovered if you are adopted earlier, but ultimately it will remain there. Think of also the Goldfarb study that also talks about kind of children in institutional care having lower IQs. So what can we say about this? Well, I think we need to kind of be quite positive about looking at the effects of institutionalization, but we also need to kind of be realistic. And one of the things we need to argue is that privation is an inadequate explanation for all the negative outcomes of children in care. The problem really is that there are often multiple risk factors that come into play, and not a single one that these children are potentially exposed to. So we could say, by just simply saying that mental retardation, disinhibited attachment is kind of the outcome of institutionalization, there could be a number of other things. So it could be, in this particular case, we saw a lot of the children, if they're privated, in other words, they weren't kind of cared for, but there's also poor substitute care, or if they have an insecure attachment with then having separation from that potential carer, or there's some kind of parental disharmony. All of these are multiple factors that may ultimately explain the outcome for those children. And of course, we can't observe these particular effects in isolation, because there's kind of other factors going on. So I talk about multiple factors here, and each of these factors could be a participant variable. So for example, we see that many of them were potentially had loss or trauma before they were taken to an institution. Some of them were abandoned. Some of them were there because of kind of health and kind of well-being. So it's possible that potentially they've experienced other kind of forms of neglect and other forms of trauma that may actually be the reason why they potentially are the way they are. And so therefore, just saying that there's only one kind of explanation of privation seems to be quite a limited way of explaining things. And there, I hope that you've got quite a good kind of understanding of Rutter and of the Romanian orphans, of the effects of institutionalization. Just to kind of finish with, there's a few other studies that perhaps have told us a few things. For example, Quinton studied a group of women who were seen as kind of lacking in kind of mental capacity, but they're very loving and caring, and the children who kind of were with them kind of thrived. And so it seems that just having kind of intellectual stimulation is not part of kind of your outcome, and we kind of need to consider that there's a lot more to kind of care than you thought. But Quinton's cohort went on to become kind of parents themselves, and they later had difficulties in parenting, kind of very similar to what we would find in Harlow, that they became poor parents as well. So that could also tell us the effects of institutionalization is that it kind of handicaps you in terms of parenting. Now there's a couple of kind of websites out there kind of looking at kind of the difficulty that these children perhaps kind of grew up and became adults, and having a look at that is definitely worth doing it. There's quite a lot of questions out there, perhaps short 4 markers like this, saying what's the difference between privation and disruption of attachment. We have kind of longer questions like this saying outline and evaluate research into the effects of institutionalization. Now this is a 12 marker because it's from an old paper, but certainly kind of says that we need to prepare ourselves a 16 marker for that. So overall, I hope that you have found this particular video interesting. We're very kind of close to the end of the course, and I'll continue to kind of make these videos for you. Okay, take care and bye.